When dogfights of the Second World War are thought of, it is likely that the images that immediately come to mind are of squadrons of RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes dueling with German Bf-109s and intercepting bombers such as the Heinkel HE-111 and Junkers Ju-88. Perhaps images also are of P-51 Mustangs, dueling with Focke-Wulf Fw-190s and Bf-109s while providing an escort to the B-17s and B-24s of the US Army Air Force on a mission to Berlin. It might be expected, therefore, that the last dogfight of the Second World War in Europe was one such engagement. Perhaps surprisingly, it was not, and it only involved two aircraft. The total combined horsepower of the two aircraft involved in the last engagement over Europe in the Second World War amounted to 305 horsepower. The Spitfire Mark V, by contrast, boasted 1,470 horsepower, while the P-51D Mustang could count upon 1,490 horsepower. The engagement was, nevertheless, remarkable. By April 1945, the Sherman tanks and M7 self-propelled guns of the 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, part of the 5th Armoured Division, were rolling across central Germany. The 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion had landed on Utah Beach on the 28th of July 1944 and had since partook in the battles across France and into Germany. The progress of the battalion had been guided by spotter pilots, flying over enemy territory ahead of the unit in small two-seat Pipper L-4 Grasshoppers. One of the most experienced Grasshopper pilots attached to the 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion was Merritt Francis, who flew a Grasshopper which he named Miss Me. On the 11th of April 1945, Francis and his observer, Lieutenant William Martin, were flying ahead of the 5th Armoured Division, approximately 100 miles to the west of Berlin. Not far from the advancing armoured vehicles on the side road, Francis and Martin noticed a German motorcycle and sidecar speeding along. Moving in to get a closer look, they then saw a Fieseler Fi-156 Storch observation aircraft flying at approximately 700 feet above some trees. Abandoning the motorcycle outfit, Francis and Martin decided that they needed to do something about the Storch, and fast, before it had a chance to report on the 5th Armoured Division's position. Turning to engage, over his radio, Francis commanded, "We are about to give combat." Diving to engage, as they dove, Francis and Martin began to blast away with their Colt 45s, trying to force the German Storch into the fire of the waiting tanks of the 5th Armoured Division. Instead, the German Storch began circling. Flying slightly above and across the Storch, Francis and Martin had opened their aircraft side door and emptied their pistols into the Storch. In this, they saw hits on its windscreen, fuel tank and right wing. Francis then gripped the Grasshopper's control column between his knees while he reloaded. He would later recall that the two planes were so close that he could see the eyeballs of the German pilot, recording that they were as big as eggs as we peppered them. Trying to avoid the American aircraft that dogged its every move, the Storch went into a low turn, too low in fact, and its right wing tip struck the ground. The Storch spun around, cartwheeling as its right wing and undercarriage were ripped apart, before finally coming to rest the right side up. Francis sat down close by and he and Martin ran to the wreck. The German crew had stumbled dazed from their machine. When they saw the Americans approaching, the pilot jumped behind a pile of sugar beet to hide while the observer dropped to the ground, defeated. Seeing that the observer had been hit in the foot, Francis ran over and went to administer help. He pulled off the man's boot. A .45 bullet fell out. Martin, his Colt 45 now reloaded, fired a warning shot and the pilot came out from behind the sugar beet with his hands up. Francis took the pilot's uniform insignia and a German flag that he found inside the Storch. He would later write, "I never found out their names. They could have been important for all I know. We turned them over to our tankers about 15 minutes later, after the injured man thanked me many times for bandaging his foot. I think they thought we would shoot them." Not long after their aerial victory, Francis and Martin were scouting ahead of the 5th when elements of the division reached the Elbe. They flew over the river and landed on the other side, only to be approached by a group of Soviet soldiers wearing grey coats and riding steppe ponies. The Russians backed off when they saw the Grasshopper's White Star insignia, but were not friendly, and later the Americans got back into their aircraft and flew back to the 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion. The two men had not realised that they were supposed to remain on the American side of the Elbe. The engagement with the Storch was not the most enthralling in history. However, it is unique for the two aircraft engaged each other in what was perhaps the last dogfight of the Second World War in Europe.